I want to start with the number, because the number is the reason none of what happened next makes sense unless you understand it first. 4. 4 coronary arteries, blocked badly enough that my cardiologist told me, on a Tuesday afternoon in September, that I needed open-heart bypass surgery within the following 2 weeks. I called my son that same evening to ask for a ride to the hospital on the morning of the procedure. What he said back to me is the reason you're watching this video, and I promise you the actual explanation, when it finally comes, 12 minutes from now, is going to completely reorganize how you feel about every single thing that happens between now and then. My name is Gerald Hobart. Everyone calls me Jerry. I'm 62 years old. I spent 34 years as a postal supervisor in Tulsa, Oklahoma, before retiring 3 years ago. And on that particular Tuesday evening in September, I called my son Bradley, 34 years old, an IT project manager who lives about 20 minutes from me, and asked him whether he could drive me to St. Francis Hospital at 6 in the morning, 11 days later, for a quadruple bypass surgery that my cardiologist had described, in language he clearly chose to make sure I understood the stakes, as not something we're treating casually. I want to give you a little more context about that diagnosis, because I think the specific urgency matters for understanding everything that followed. I'd gone in for what I expected to be an ordinary follow-up appointment, some mild chest tightness I'd been experiencing for a few weeks that I'd mostly attributed to indigestion, the kind of thing a man my age tells himself is nothing until a doctor tells him otherwise. My cardiologist, Dr. Patel, ran a stress test that afternoon that he stopped early, a specific detail I didn't fully appreciate the significance of until he explained, sitting across from me in his office 20 minutes later, that the test results combined with my family history. My own father had died of a heart attack at 58, and my older brother had needed his own bypass surgery at 52, put me in a category he described carefully as urgent rather than elective. 4. Within 2 weeks, not eventually. I remember the specific, disorienting experience of that stress test being cut short, a technician's expression shifting almost imperceptibly as she watched a monitor I couldn't see, followed by Dr. Patel himself coming into the room considerably faster than the ordinary pace of a routine appointment usually called for. I've thought since about how much information passes silently between medical professionals in moments like that, a specific unspoken urgency that patients pick up on before anyone's actually said the alarming thing out loud. By the time Dr. Patel sat me down in his office, I already half knew from that shifted expression alone that I wasn't going to be hearing good news. He walked me through the imaging himself, pointing to specific areas of significant blockage across 4 separate arteries, explaining the surgery in enough detail that I understood, by the end of that conversation, exactly what the following weeks were going to require of me. I called Carol's name out loud, in my head, more than once during that appointment, an old habit from the 2 years of her own treatment that apparently hadn't fully faded even 6 years after her death. Some part of me still instinctively reaching for her steadiness, whenever I received hard medical news of my own. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. Bradley's response, and I want to give it to you exactly the way he said it because I've replayed the specific tone more times than I want to admit, was this: "Dad, can you just take a cab? I've got plans that morning. I really can't move them." And then, before I could say much of anything back, he told me he had to go, and the call ended. If you've been enjoying stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel, and I promise you this one has more turns in it than you're expecting. Now let's get back to it. I want to describe what that phone call did to me, sitting alone in my kitchen at 62 years old, 11 days out from open-heart surgery, because I think it matters for understanding every decision I made afterward, some of which I now regret and some of which I still, even now, don't entirely regret at all. I didn't feel angry, not at first. I felt something closer to a specific, hollow confusion, the kind that comes from hearing a sentence from someone you love that simply doesn't compute against everything you thought you knew about your relationship with them. Bradley and I have never had an easy relationship exactly, but we've never had a cruel one either. And take a cab. I've got plans, landed with a strangeness that took me most of that evening to even begin processing. My late wife, Carol, passed 6 years ago, of ovarian cancer, after a fight that lasted just under 2 years and that I still, 6 years later, don't fully feel like I've finished grieving. Bradley took her death hard, considerably harder than his usual steady, even-keeled temperament let him show at the time, and I've wondered often in the years since whether some of the distance that occasionally settled between us afterward had roots in how differently we each processed losing her. Me talking about her constantly, almost compulsively, in the first year. Bradley going the opposite direction, quiet and private with his own grief in a way that sometimes felt to me like he was shutting me out, though I understand now it was simply his own way of coping. That phone call about the ride to surgery wasn't simply an inconvenience about transportation logistics. It was, in the moment, the sound of the one person I most expected to show up for open-heart surgery telling me he had somewhere better to be. I sat with that feeling for about an hour before I did something I want to be completely honest with you about, because I think the honesty matters more than making myself look good in this story. I called my lawyer. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe, because the next part is where this story stops being simple. Diane Voss has been my estate attorney for 19 years, since shortly after Carol and I first drew up our wills when Bradley was still in high school. And over those 19 years, she's become something closer to an old friend than simply a professional I retain for paperwork. She'd been Carol's attorney too in the final months, helping us both navigate the specific, exhausting paperwork of updating medical directives and estate documents, while Carol was still lucid enough to make her own wishes clear. Work Diane did with a quiet, patient compassion that neither Carol nor I ever fully forgot. I called her that Tuesday evening, honestly, more to vent than for any specific legal purpose, telling her what Bradley had just said, half expecting her to offer some sympathetic but ultimately unhelpful commiseration before we hung up. What she actually said changed the entire shape of the next 3 weeks. "Jerry," she told me, "I'm driving you to that hospital myself. 11 days from now, 6 in the morning, I'll be in your driveway. And I think, separately, we should talk about your will, but not tonight. Tonight, I just want you to know you're not taking a cab to open-heart surgery. That's not happening. If this story has you hooked, drop a comment and hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I still think about most." I want to be honest that Diane's offer to drive me herself meant more to me, in that moment, than almost anything else that happened during that entire stretch. And I want to describe the specific morning of the surgery, because it matters for understanding what came afterward. She was in my driveway at 5:45, 15 minutes early, carrying a thermos of coffee she'd made for both of us, and a specific, steady calm that did more to settle my nerves than anything the hospital's own pre-op staff managed to do a few hours later. I remember the drive itself, the two of us mostly quiet, Tulsa still dark and empty at that hour, Diane occasionally offering small, practical reassurances that sent. Francis had an excellent cardiac surgery program, that she'd looked up my specific surgeon's outcomes the night before out of her own thoroughness, that she'd be right there in the waiting room the entire time so I wouldn't have to wonder whether anyone was actually there for me. I want to describe what it meant in that specific, vulnerable pre-dawn drive, to have someone who wasn't obligated by blood to be there choosing to show up anyway, with a level of care that felt, that morning, considerably more present than the absence I was still trying not to think about. At one point during that drive, somewhere around the halfway mark, Diane reached over without a word and turned the radio down, just enough to let a comfortable quiet settle between us. And I remember thinking, in that specific moment, that she seemed to understand exactly how much or how little conversation I actually needed better than I understood it myself. A specific, intuitive kindness that 19 years of professional relationship had apparently built into something considerably deeper than either of us had ever explicitly named. She stayed the entire day, sitting in the surgical waiting room for nearly 6 hours, and she was the first face I saw, considerably more alert than I probably should have been that early out of anesthesia, when I finally came out of recovery. She told me later that she'd spent part of those 6 hours making phone calls on my behalf, letting a few of my closer friends know the surgery was underway, and part of it simply sitting with the specific, ordinary anxiety of waiting for news about someone she genuinely cared about. An anxiety she said she hadn't expected to feel as strongly as she did, given that our relationship had started 19 years earlier as a purely professional one. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. Bradley did not come to the hospital that day. I want to sit with that fact for a moment because I think it's easy, hearing this story, to assume you already understand the shape of what happened, and I promise you that you don't yet, not completely. He didn't call that morning. He didn't call that evening. He sent a text message around 8 that night, 3 words long. How'd it go? I didn't answer it for 2 days. I genuinely didn't know what to say back to him that wasn't going to come out considerably angrier than I wanted it to, lying in a hospital bed with a healing sternum and more time than I wanted to think about exactly why my only son hadn't shown up. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. Diane visited me twice during my 6-day hospital stay, and it was during the second visit, 4 days after the surgery, that she raised the subject of my will directly, carefully, in the specific measured way I'd come to expect from her over 19 years of working together. "Jerry," she said, "I'm not going to tell you what to feel about what Bradley did. That's not my place. But you asked me before the surgery whether we should talk about updating your estate plan, and I think, now that you're stable and thinking clearly, it's worth having that conversation whenever you're ready." I want to be honest that I was not, in that hospital bed, thinking entirely clearly, not about this particular subject. I told Diane I wanted to move forward with removing Bradley as primary beneficiary and executor of my estate, replacing him with my daughter. I should mention here, because I haven't yet, that I have a daughter too, Lauren, 31, who lives in Denver and who had called me every single day of that hospital stay, sometimes twice, despite being over 600 miles away and unable to physically be there herself. Lauren works as a physical therapist in Denver, married with a young daughter of her own, and while distance had kept her from being physically present for my surgery, I want to describe the specific texture of those daily calls, because they mattered more to me than I fully appreciated at the time. She'd call every morning before my first round of physical therapy exercises, checking in on my pain levels, asking specific, informed questions about my recovery that told me she'd been researching bypass recovery timelines on her own. And every evening, a second call shorter, just to say goodnight the way she'd done as a little girl. I remember thinking, lying in that hospital bed, that Lauren's daily calls from 600 miles away felt considerably more present than Bradley's silence from 20 minutes down the road. A specific, painful comparison that shaped my thinking more than I probably should have let it in that raw, vulnerable state. Diane didn't argue with my decision in that hospital room. She simply told me she'd draft the documents and we'd finalize everything once I was fully recovered and had time to sit with the decision away from the immediate hurt of the moment. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. I want you to hold onto that specific detail, that Diane insisted on waiting until I'd fully recovered before finalizing anything, because it's going to matter enormously in about 8 minutes. And I think it's worth noticing, right now, that a woman who had every professional reason to simply do what her client asked instead chose to build in a deliberate delay. A specific kind of caution I didn't fully appreciate until much later. I was discharged 6 days after the surgery, and I want to describe the 3 weeks that followed, because they were, in their own quiet way, some of the loneliest weeks of my life, considerably lonelier than I expected recovering from major surgery to feel. Lauren flew in for the first week, staying with me, managing my medications, driving me to 2 follow-up appointments, and her presence made an enormous difference. But she had to fly back to Denver eventually, back to her own job and her own life. And the 2 weeks after she left were the 2 weeks I spent, mostly alone in my house, turning over the Bradley situation again and again without ever quite reaching a place of peace about it. I remember those 2 weeks with a specific, heavy stillness, mornings spent slowly working through the physical therapy, exercises my surgeon had prescribed, afternoons in a recliner in my living room, considerably more time alone with my own thoughts than I'd had in years. Most of it circling back to that Tuesday night phone call, no matter how hard I tried to redirect it elsewhere. I watched more television during those 2 weeks than I had in the preceding decade combined. Less because I was actually interested in what was on and more because the noise gave my mind somewhere to rest besides the specific, wounded loop it kept returning to. A few neighbors checked in during that stretch, bringing casseroles in the specific well-meaning way neighbors do, and my old friend from the Postal Service, Ray Delgado, came by twice to sit with me for an afternoon. But I want to be honest that even those visits carried a specific undertone of loneliness. Everyone asking, at some point, whether Bradley had been by to help. A question I'd learned to deflect with an increasingly practiced vagueness that fooled nobody, including myself. Ray and I had worked together for over 20 years before we both retired within a year of each other, and he'd been one of the first people I called after Carol's diagnosis. Years earlier, a friendship built on the specific, unglamorous solidarity of 2 men who'd spent decades handling other people's mail together and had, somewhere along the way, become genuinely important to each other's lives. During his second visit, about 10 days into my recovery, he finally asked me directly, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table, what was actually going on with Bradley, having noticed, correctly, that my vague deflections weren't holding up to any real scrutiny. I told him the whole story that afternoon, the phone call, Diane driving me instead, the will revision I'd already set in motion. And I remember Ray listening without interrupting, the way he'd always been good at, before finally telling me gently that hurt people make their worst decisions when they are most alone with their hurt, and that maybe I should talk to Bradley directly before I let a lawyer's paperwork make a permanent decision my own heart hadn't fully settled. I didn't take his advice immediately. I wish, looking back, that I had. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. Bradley called twice during those 3 weeks. I answered neither call. I want to be honest that this was its own kind of petness on my part, a specific, wounded silence I maintained partly because I genuinely didn't know what to say and partly because some part of me wanted him to feel exactly the kind of unanswered absence he'd handed me on the morning of my surgery. I'm not proud of that particular choice, looking back, though I understand now considerably more about why I made it than I understood at the time. I remember staring at his name on my phone screen both times, my thumb hovering over the answer button for several rings before I let the call go to voicemail. And I remember the specific, hollow satisfaction I felt each time, a satisfaction that curdled almost immediately into something closer to shame once the call had actually ended, and I was left alone again with the silence I'd just chosen. He left a voicemail after the second call, a short one, just asking me to call him back when I had a chance, his voice carrying a specific strain I registered, but didn't let myself fully examine at the time. It was Lauren who finally broke through my silence, calling me on a Sunday evening, 22 days after the surgery, her voice carrying a specific urgency I didn't immediately recognize. "Dad," she said, "I need to tell you something about Bradley, and I need you to actually listen before you say anything, because I think you've gotten this completely wrong. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because what she told me next is not what you're expecting." I want to describe the specific way that conversation unfolded, because I think the order Lauren chose to tell me things in mattered enormously for how I eventually understood the full situation. She told me first that she'd found out entirely by accident, running into Bradley's wife, Melissa, at a family friend's birthday party the previous weekend. A conversation that started as ordinary small talk and gradually turned into something considerably heavier once Melissa realized Lauren didn't already know what she was about to describe. Lauren told me she'd asked Melissa, casually, whether Bradley was doing okay, given how distant he'd seemed at a recent family gathering, and that Melissa had gone quiet for a moment before asking, carefully, whether Lauren actually knew what had been going on with Bradley over the past several weeks. When Lauren said no, she didn't, Melissa's face had apparently shifted into a specific, visible concern, and she'd asked whether they could step outside for a minute, away from the noise of the party, because what she needed to explain wasn't something she wanted to say in passing between the cake and the gift table. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. Bradley had gone in for a routine work physical, the kind his employer required annually, about 6 weeks before my surgery, and the physical had flagged an abnormal EKG reading, something the company doctor described as concerning enough to warrant an immediate referral to a cardiologist. Bradley, Melissa told Lauren, had been terrified from the moment he got that referral, terrified specifically because our family has a documented history of early coronary artery disease on my side. My own father died of a heart attack at 58. My older brother had his first bypass surgery at 52. And I was, at that exact moment, 11 days from a quadruple bypass of my own at 62. Bradley, 34 years old, had spent 6 weeks quietly terrified that he was looking at the early edge of the exact same inherited condition, and he had scheduled his first cardiology consultation, the specialist appointment that would tell him whether his fear was justified, for the exact same morning as my surgery, an appointment slot that had taken 3 weeks to get, and that he was too frightened to reschedule, and too frightened, in a considerably more complicated, to explain to me at all. If you've been enjoying stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. I want to describe what it felt like, sitting in my own living room, 22 days after telling my lawyer to remove my son from my will, hearing my daughter explain that the morning Bradley had told me he had plans. Those plans had been a cardiology appointment he was too scared to admit he needed. On the exact same day I was undergoing surgery for the exact hereditary condition he was afraid he might be developing himself. I did not say anything for a long moment. I remember setting the phone down on the coffee table just for a second, needing my hands to be doing something other than holding it while I tried to process what she just told me. Why didn't he just tell me? I finally asked, my voice coming out smaller than I expected. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. Melissa said he was terrified you'd think he was making your surgery about himself, Lauren. She said he kept saying over and over that you had enough to worry about without him adding his own health scare on top of it, especially if it turned out to be nothing, which he was desperately hoping it would be. She said he almost told you a dozen times and talked himself out of it every single time, worried it would sound like he was trying to steal attention away from your own surgery. So instead he just said he had plans, because he genuinely couldn't figure out how to say the real thing without it sounding exactly like the thing he was most afraid of it sounding like. Lauren told me Melissa had described, too, the specific toll those 6 weeks had taken on Bradley at home, weeks she'd watched him grow increasingly withdrawn and anxious without fully understanding, at first, exactly why, until he finally broke down and told her about the referral about 10 days before my surgery. Melissa had wanted him to tell me immediately, Lauren said, had actually argued with him about it more than once during those final days, but Bradley had remained convinced, right up until the morning of the phone call, that saying nothing was somehow the more protective, more loving choice. A conviction Melissa had never fully agreed with but had ultimately respected as his decision to make about his own fear. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. I want to describe the specific, complicated grief that hit me in that moment, understanding that my son hadn't chosen his own convenience over showing up for me, the way I'd spent 3 weeks believing. He'd been sitting alone with a genuine, inherited fear about his own mortality, at 34 years old, on the exact morning I was facing mine, and he'd chosen silence specifically because he didn't want his fear to become one more burden on me during the hardest morning of my own life. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going. I called Diane Voss the following morning, before I'd even fully processed everything Lauren had told me, and asked her whether the will revision documents had been finalized yet, whether anything had actually been signed. I want to describe the specific relief in her voice when she told me that no, nothing had been signed, that she deliberately kept the documents in draft form, waiting, exactly as she told me in that hospital room, until I'd had genuine time and distance from the raw hurt of the moment. I had a feeling there might be more to this story, Jerry, she told me. I've known you 19 years. That phone call the night before your surgery didn't sound like the whole picture. I didn't want to rush a decision this permanent based on one incomplete evening. If this story has you hooked, drop a comment, and hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I still think about most. I want to describe the conversation I finally had with Bradley 4 days after Lauren's call, because I think it's the most important part of this entire story, and I've thought about how to tell it to you carefully, because I don't want to skip past how difficult it actually was for both of us. I drove to his house myself, my first time driving since the surgery, a specific milestone I'd been looking forward to for entirely different reasons than the one that actually got me behind the wheel that day. My physical therapy during those weeks was its own slow, humbling process. 3 sessions a week with a therapist named Angela who had the specific patient bluntness I came to appreciate more than I expected to. Correcting my form on basic walking exercises with the same directness she probably used with much younger patients, refusing to let my age or my surgery become an excuse for cutting corners on the exercises that were going to determine how fully I have. I remember one particular session, about 2 weeks in, when Angela asked casually how my support system at home was holding up, and I gave her the same vague deflection I'd been giving everyone else. And I remember her looking at me for a moment with an expression that told me she saw straight through it, though she was professional enough not to push. I want to describe the drive to Bradley's house itself, because it mattered to me in ways I didn't fully expect. I drove slowly, the first time behind the wheel in nearly a month, hyper-aware of every turn and every stop in a way that surprised me, my body apparently having decided, somewhere in the preceding weeks, to treat ordinary driving with a caution it had never required before the surgery. I remember rehearsing what I wanted to say the entire 20 minutes, discarding several openings that felt either too accusatory or too soft, finally settling, by the time I pulled into his driveway, on simply telling him the truth as plainly as I could manage. Bradley opened the door looking, immediately, like a man who'd been expecting this exact conversation for 3 weeks and dreading it the entire time. I didn't wait for him to explain anything. I told him, standing in his own doorway, that Lauren had told me everything: the EC, the referral, the cardiology appointment, the exact reason he'd said what he said on the phone that Tuesday night. I watched his face go through a rapid, visible collapse of relief and shame simultaneously, and he asked me, his voice breaking in a way I hadn't heard from my son since he was a teenager, whether I hated him for not telling me the truth. He stepped back from the door and let me inside, and I remember the specific, careful quiet of his living room, Melissa nowhere in sight, having apparently, I learned later, deliberately taken their daughter out for the afternoon to give Bradley and me the privacy she suspected we were going to need. I noticed, sitting down, a stack of medical paperwork on the coffee table that Bradley moved aside quickly, almost reflexively, before I could get a clear look at it. A small, telling gesture of a man still not quite ready, even in that moment, to have his own health be the visible center of attention. We sat down across from each other, Bradley on the edge of his own couch in a posture that reminded me, uncomfortably, of a man bracing for a verdict rather than having a conversation with his own father. If you've been enjoying stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel. If you've been enjoying stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel. I don't hate you, I told him. I spent 3 weeks hurt, genuinely hurt, believing you'd simply chosen not to show up. I even went and changed my will, Bradley. I want you to know that because I think you deserve the full truth the same way I needed it from you. I told my lawyer to take you off as executor, to remove you as primary beneficiary. It's not signed. It's not final. But I did that out of hurt, without understanding what was actually happening on your side of that phone call. I want to describe Bradley's reaction to that particular confession because it surprised me. He didn't get defensive, didn't ask me to feel guilty about it. He simply nodded slowly and told me he understood completely, that if their positions had been reversed, he probably would have done the exact same thing, given what I actually knew at the time. "I should have just told you," he said. "I kept telling myself I was protecting you from one more thing to worry about, but honestly, Dad, I think I was mostly protecting myself. I didn't want to say the fear out loud, because saying it out loud made it real in a way I wasn't ready for. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because this one isn't finished yet." We sat in his living room for nearly 3 hours that afternoon, working through everything, not just that specific Tuesday, but a broader pattern we both eventually admitted, of Bradley and me struggling for years to talk directly about hard things, both of us defaulting to a kind of surface-level politeness that had let genuine crises pass between us disguised as minor inconveniences. "I've got plans standing in for I'm terrified," the same way Bradley pointed out years earlier, that I was just tired during a stretch when Carol's cancer diagnosis had genuinely terrified me too much to say so directly. I remember Bradley telling me, at one point during that long afternoon, about the specific moment he'd received the referral call from his company doctor's office, sitting alone in his car in a parking garage at work, the specific dread of hearing a nurse recommend an urgent cardiology consultation, using almost the exact same language my own doctor had used with me just weeks earlier. He told me he'd sat in that parking garage for almost 20 minutes afterward, unable to make himself drive home, running through the same family history I'd been living inside my own body for years, our father, our uncle, me, and arriving in that parking garage at a specific private terror he hadn't known how to share with anyone, not Melissa at first, and certainly not me, given everything I was already facing. I kept telling myself there'd be a better time. And then your surgery got scheduled, and suddenly there was never going to be a better time again, because every single conversation we had for those 11 days was about you, as it should have been, and I just kept swallowing it, telling myself I'd deal with it after you were through the worst of your own recovery. And then the appointment landed on the exact same morning, and I panicked, and instead of just telling you the truth, I said the worst possible thing I could have said instead. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because this one isn't finished yet. I asked him, finally, about the cardiology appointment itself, the one that had actually happened that morning while I was in surgery. He told me the specialist had found a mild arrhythmia, concerning enough to warrant ongoing monitoring and a follow-up stress test, but not, as far as they could currently tell, the same advanced coronary disease that had affected my father, my brother, and me. He was going to need regular cardiac monitoring for the rest of his life, a genuinely serious, ongoing medical reality, but not, thankfully, an immediate crisis on the scale of what I'd just been through. I want to describe what it felt like hearing that specific piece of relief inside an otherwise difficult conversation, watching some of the tension visibly leave Bradley's shoulders as he told me, as though saying the actual diagnosis out loud, finally, to the one person he'd most been avoiding telling, had lifted a portion of the weight he'd been carrying alone for 6 weeks. He told me he'd cried in his car after that first cardiology appointment, sitting alone in the same hospital parking structure where I was, at that exact hour, still under anesthesia, relief and lingering fear tangled together in a way he said he hadn't fully known how to process without anyone to share it with. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. I want to describe the specific relief I felt driving home from Bradley's house that evening, a feeling considerably larger than simply resolving an argument, closer to the feeling of a weight I hadn't fully realized I was carrying finally being set down. I called Diane the following week and told her to shred the draft documents entirely, that I wanted my original will reinstated exactly as it had stood before that Tuesday night. Bradley as executor, Bradley and Lauren as equal beneficiaries. The same document that had reflected who my family actually was before one devastating misunderstanding nearly convinced me to rewrite it based on an incomplete picture of what had really happened. Diane and I spent almost an hour on the phone that day, considerably longer than the strictly practical matter of reinstating a will required, and I think both of us understood, without needing to say it directly, that the call had become as much about processing what had almost happened as it was about the paperwork itself. She told me she'd handled dozens of estate disputes over her career, family fractures over money, and perceived slights that had calcified into permanent, bitter rifts, and that watching one narrowly avoided, in real time, with a client she genuinely cared about, had affected her more than she expected a routine document revision to. I want to describe something Diane told me during that final call that I've thought about often since. "Jerry," she said, "I want to tell you something I don't usually say to clients because it's not strictly my job to say it. I've watched a lot of families make permanent decisions based on incomplete, painful moments over 19 years of doing this work. Most of the time, by the time anyone comes back to me wanting to undo it, it's already signed, already final, already doing damage that's very hard to walk back. You got lucky this time, not because you were careful, but because your daughter loved you enough to make you slow down and actually find out the truth before it was too late. Not everyone gets that." She told me that same call about a case from earlier in her career, details altered enough to protect the family's privacy, but the shape of it clear enough to make her point. A father who'd cut a daughter out of his will entirely after a single misunderstood comment at a holiday dinner, a decision that had gone through, fully signed and finalized, before anyone learned the actual context behind what the daughter had said. By the time the truth came out 2 years later, the father had already passed away himself, the document unchanged, the daughter left to carry both the original hurt and the permanent, unresolvable knowledge that her father had died still believing something about her that had never actually been true. "That's the version of this story I didn't want for you and Bradley," Diane told me. "I've seen how it ends when nobody builds in the pause. I wasn't going to let that happen on my watch if I could help it. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think." I want to describe how that monthly three-way call actually started, because Lauren proposed it about 2 weeks after my conversation with Bradley, calling both of us together for the first time, half joking that she was appointing herself the family's official check-in coordinator, whether either of us liked the title or not. The first call was, predictably, a little stilted, all three of us visibly unpracticed at the specific vulnerability the format required. But by the third or fourth month, it had settled into something genuinely valuable, a standing space where Bradley told us about his follow-up testing before either of us had to ask, where I found myself, more than once, admitting to a bad week I would once have simply powered through in silence, where Lauren, too, started using the space to talk about her own stresses juggling work, and a young daughter 600 miles from either of us. I remember one particular call, maybe 5 months in, when Bradley opened by simply saying, "I had a scary appointment this week, and I want to talk about it instead of pretending it didn't happen." A sentence so different from the version of my son who'd once said, "Take a cab. I've got plans," that I actually had to sit with it for a moment before responding, understanding, in that small, unremarkable Tuesday evening phone call, exactly how much genuine distance we'd covered since that first difficult September. I didn't know, sitting in Bradley's living room that afternoon, working through 3 hours of overdue honesty with my son, that the cardiologist's follow-up monitoring over the following months was going to reveal something considerably more significant than the initial mild arrhythmia diagnosis, requiring a second, more detailed round of testing that Bradley this time told me about immediately, the very same week he scheduled it. A specific, deliberate change in how he handled fear that neither of us had to discuss out loud to fully understand the significance of. I didn't know that Lauren, watching how close our family had come to a permanent, painful rupture built on a single misunderstood phone call, was going to propose something to both Bradley and me that neither of us had considered: a standing, monthly three-way phone call between the three of us, specifically designed to make sure nothing this significant ever again went 3 weeks without being said out loud. I also didn't know, sitting in that living room, that my brother, hearing about everything that had happened through Lauren, was going to call me himself for the first time in almost 2 years, wanting to talk finally about our own father's death and the specific, unspoken fear both of us had apparently been carrying separately about our own hearts, or that his call was going to open up a considerably larger conversation about our family's medical history than any of us had. One that was going to reveal something about our father's final years that none of us, including me, had fully understood until that phone call finally happened. But that's a story for next time. The truest thing I can tell you, several months removed from that Tuesday evening phone call, is that the most dangerous sentence in any family isn't usually the cruel one. It's the vague one, the one that sounds like indifference but is actually hiding something considerably more complicated underneath it, something the person saying it doesn't yet have the words or the courage to explain directly. Bradley didn't fail to show up for my surgery because he didn't care. He failed to show up because he was sitting alone with a fear about his own mortality that he didn't know how to say out loud on the exact morning I needed him most, and I very nearly let that misunderstanding cost him his place in my will, and very nearly cost the two of us years of repair that a single honest conversation, 3 weeks later, managed to prevent entirely. I think often about how differently this story could have ended if Diane Voss had been a different kind of attorney, one who simply did exactly what a hurt client asked without building in the specific, deliberate pause she insisted on. I think about how differently it could have ended if Lauren hadn't happened to run into Melissa at that birthday party, or if Melissa had decided, understandably, that Bradley's medical privacy wasn't hers to discuss with anyone, even his own sister. So much of what actually saved this particular story from becoming a permanent, quiet family fracture depended on a series of small, almost accidental kindnesses: a lawyer's professional caution, a sister's instinct to ask one more question at a party, a sister-in-law's decision to trust that honesty mattered more than discretion in that specific moment. I don't think any family should have to depend that heavily on accident to find its way back to the truth. I've tried in the months since to build a little more intention into how my own family communicates, rather than continuing to rely on the specific, fragile luck that happened to save us this particular time. That's part of what the monthly calls are actually for, I think, underneath the more obvious purpose of simply staying in touch. They're an attempt to build, deliberately, the kind of honest space that Ray Delgado's blunt advice, and Diane's careful pause, and Lauren's persistent instincts all had to work overtime to create for us. This once, out of pure accumulated goodwill rather than any structure we'd actually put in place ourselves ahead of time. Bradley and I talk considerably more directly now than we ever did before that Tuesday night, and I want to be honest that it hasn't always been comfortable. Building a new habit of saying hard things out loud after decades of both of us defaulting to easier, vaguer versions of the truth. We had a difficult conversation just last month, when his follow-up cardiac monitoring flagged something his specialist wanted to investigate further, and I watched him, in that moment, choose to call me immediately rather than sit with it alone the way he once would have. A specific, deliberate change that told me, more clearly than anything else could have, how much that afternoon in his living room had actually shifted between us. That specific phone call, I should say, ended with reassuring news. Nothing beyond the arrhythmia he'd already been managing, no new complications, just a routine adjustment to his monitoring schedule. But what stayed with me wasn't the medical outcome. It was the fact that he'd called me the moment he got the referral, before he even knew what it might mean, simply because he'd decided, somewhere in the months since that afternoon, that carrying fear alone was no longer the choice he wanted to keep making in his family or in mine. I think about how close that was, sometimes, more than I think about the surgery itself. 4 blocked arteries, it turns out, were considerably easier to fix than 3 weeks of silence almost. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. Thanks for being here. For real.